We are talking right now with Genevieve Beauchemin about buried evidence on CTV's W5. More than 30 years after being convicted of 4 murders in Brossard, Quebec, Daniel Jolivet is still proclaiming his innocence. In his first English broadcast interview for W5, we hear about a Quebec prison and the inside of it. And we hear Genevieve speak with Daniel about the boxes of evidence that he and his lawyers have fought to uncover over decades to seek justice. Now, you'll be able to watch this on Saturday, February the 4th at 7 p.m. on CTV's W5. But to start off right now, could you tell me just a little bit about what your impression of Daniel was when you met him in the prison?
It's an interesting thing to walk through these prison walls, to walk through the gates, hear them slam shut behind you. And I walked in there, and then I sat in the visitors' room across this table from this man who's been convicted of 4 murders, quadruple murders. And so he is there. He walks in. He looks completely different, of course, than when he went into prison more than 30 years ago. He's now a man in his 60s. He walks with a cane after an injury. He is also a man who speaks so much because I come to understand a little bit later in the interview, he feels as though he has to compress all the evidence that he thinks will exonerate him, all the facts that he believes point to his innocence. He has to tell me everything about it in just a few moments. And so he just talks and talks and talks about all the details of the case. And it's a complicated case. It does date back 30 years. It's 4 murders that happened. He knew the victims. 2 of them were people, men with criminal records. He did business with them. He says to me in the first moments of the interview, I was not the kind of guy who went to church every day. He is a man who was linked to crime, had been arrested a number of times before he was arrested and convicted of these murders. But he says, I'm a crook. I am not a murderer. And he insists on trying to prove that from behind bars. And he's been doing that for more than 30 years.
Well, and this conviction for the 4 murders took place in 1992. And as you said, he was compressing this evidence. He felt he had to get it across. What was some of the most compelling points that you came across in this evidence that was presented?
Yeah. So he was arrested in 92. He was convicted at the end of a trial in 94.
Excuse
And
me.
some of the things that he does, I mean, it's interesting because when you look at some of the work that he's done behind prison bars, for instance, he talks about the fact that he bought with the money that he earned working in prison, he bought this like craft roll of paper that he unrolled on his prison cell floor, and he drafted with colored markers this chart. He basically, to him, that's his sort of like the evidence, irrefutable evidence, the roadmap to his innocence, detailing who was when and where at the time of the murders, and you know, where, how it's impossible for him to have been there, and now it's impossible for him, he says, to have confessed to the murder, because one of the most the cornerstone of the case against him was the fact that there was a snitch who said that he had confessed to the murder at a restaurant in the morning after the murders. Well, Daniel Jolivet says, I couldn't have been there. When you look at all the evidence that I have with all these cell phone records and all these records that I've been able to get my hands on over the past 30 years from behind prison walls by writing hundreds of letters, filling out access to information documents, I've been able to get my hands on these records. And he believes that that's evidence that shows that he should have at least a new trial.
Uh, I'm trying to imagine having the fortitude to do access to information behind bars, because doing it in newsrooms alone can be so strenuous sometimes with how long it takes. Was there any evidence, though, that you came across or that you were shown that connected Danielle to the case? You know, is there the possibility that maybe DNA or forensics might be able to clear his name? Because we're at a very different point today than we were back then.
We are at a very different point. And in terms of physical evidence, there's no physical evidence that links him to the murders, except, of course, as we were saying earlier, he does know the victims. He did business with them. He was with the victims hours before these murders happened. There is that snitch. There is some of that information. He says that he's able to disprove everything about that case. And there is DNA evidence that was collected on the scene, but it was only checked against Danielle's DNA, and it was found not to be his. What Danielle has complained about for many, many years is he says that police and they did the investigation. They only looked at him as the suspect. They didn't compare this evidence against any other potential suspects. And that, he says, is part of the case that he's been trying to build to get a new trial.
And we're talking here about, new evidence and new documents that were found through access to information. Were there anything that was found outside of the access to information, or was that just primarily how he came about things?
It was a lot of what he came about things. He wrote letters, hundreds of letters to all sorts, anyone he could think of that would provide information. There's also a polygraph test. That's not admissible in court. It's not something that the courts feel, has never been admissible in court. But he did pass a polygraph test not that long ago, a few years ago. And he says that he has added that to the evidence that he has presented to the Criminal Conviction Review Group, which is the group that is currently in charge of reviewing criminal convictions, like the sort that Danielle says. The people who write to that commission make a submission to the commission, to that group, for a new trial or for simply just the end of the procedures against them. And he basically has made 3 appeals to that particular commission, 3 submissions. They've been rejected. There's another one now underway. One of the interesting aspects we came across while doing this W5 is that this review group is under the microscope right now because there has been some criticism of it. People who've looked at it say that it's barely adequate, that in many ways it needs a complete overhaul. There's actually a report that was commissioned by the current Justice Minister, David Lametti, and he now has the report. He's had it in his hands since the fall, and that report says that there should be a complete overhaul of that system, that basically one of the authors says it's almost nearly impossible to have your conviction overturned under the system unless you're lucky. So that's pretty chilling when you think about that. So that is something, and that is something that Lametti says that he has endeavored, he's working on changing right now.
Well, and that's a conversation for another day that might become a very political hot button issue, especially with conversations of bail reform. You could see that becoming overlapped all in one. It seems that we have a bit more of a tough on justice conversation occurring now than we did a few years back. Genevieve, I want to thank you so much for joining me to chat about this. It's so interesting, and I recommend everybody listening watch Buried Evidence on CTV W5s. You can do that on Saturday, February 4th at 7 p.m. Genevieve, thank you.
Thank you so much.
You have a wonderful day.
Bye.